Hello, everyone, and welcome to Explain Apologetics. We are thrilled that you could be joining us for yet another interesting discussion. Today, unlike the previous ones that we've been having, which were debates, today is going to be a lot more civil, a lot more content-wise. We're going to be discussing. It's a dialogue between two people that have done extensive work in the topic that we're going to be discussing. The topic of today's discussion will be, are all the Gospels equal? And by equal, of course, we're talking in terms of reliability. And joining us first up to discuss that, by the way, before we go into those speakers, I do want to inform you that we'll be looking at two Gospels in particular that may be new to some of you. Number one, the Gospel of Thomas, and secondly, the Gospel of Peter. And just to introduce our two panelists who will be joining us to discuss this topic, we have first up Dr. Robert Price. It's a privilege to have Dr. Robert Price with us. Dr. Price is a noted fellow of the Jesus Seminar and also the Jesus Project. He's got his PhD in systematic theology and PhD in New Testament, both from Drew University. He's a world-renowned scholar in this area. He calls himself a Christian atheist, I believe. And let me welcome Dr. Price and just ask Dr. Price, thank you for joining us. What do you mean by Christian atheist? If you could just clarify that for us.
Well, I find myself as intrigued with Christianity and Christian belief as I ever was as a believer. I take it all quite seriously. I have little patience with atheists and others who just ridicule the whole thing. I just feel like they don't really know what they're talking about. They don't take it as a comparative religion scholar would, or even an anthropologist. And I find it all very powerful, and I love it. I just, as a matter of philosophical opinion, it seems to me highly unlikely that there is a God. And I'm not sure, though this is a completely different issue, whether there was a historical Jesus or not. I tend to think probably not, though who could know? And with the Christian atheist tag, I'm mainly getting that from Thomas Altizer. And in his books, many books, but especially The Gospel of Christian Atheism and The Descent into Hell, where he kind of reconfigures, well, before the term was in fashion, he sort of deconstructed the gospel and said he thought that the point really was much like in Buddhism, and the idea of the bodhisattva, and the one who visits the human race to try to help it out of its sorrow and pain and degradation and so on. They said he thought that the real logic of the crucifixion was that in Christ, God was crucified and didn't rise, but rather descended into hell, though he understands that in an abstract way, that the sacred was poured out into the profane. Again, much like in Buddhism, well, where do you find nirvana? Well, it's in the midst of samsara. And that's where you belong, trying to ease the suffering of humanity. And that really captured me. And I felt like this is not standard brand Christianity, but it sure sees a deep seriousness in it. And I don't mind flying that flag. It's like even Richard Dawkins said that he was a cultural Christian. He would go to church on Christmas and sing Christmas songs and all that. Well, I guess you could say that's enough to call yourself a Christian atheist, but I do go beyond it in Altizer's direction.
Absolutely. Well, it's a privilege to have you on, sir. And for those of you who don't know, Dr. Robert Price has debated some of the best Christian apologists out there, including Dr. William Lane Craig. That was, I believe, in 1990s. Can't remember the exact year.
Amazing.
1990s, 1999, if I'm not mistaken. And he's also debated James White and Dr. Bart Ehrman as well. So he's a renowned scholar. It's a true privilege to have you on our channel, sir.
Oh, no less a privilege to be on it.
Thank you. And well, we also have on representing, for example, the side that will be discussing who basically affirms the canonical Gospels as being more reliable than the other Gospels. We have Dr. Stephen Boyce with us. Dr. Stephen Boyce, no stranger to this channel at all. He's done his first PhD and now working on his second PhD, where area of interest or research in his second PhD focuses on the topic of today's discussion, particularly the Gospel of Thomas. And for those of you who don't know, Dr. Stephen Boyce has also done a translation of the Gospel of Peter into English. It's again a privilege to always have you back, Dr. Stephen Boyce, and thank you for doing so.
Samuel, always a privilege to be on your show. And thank you to Dr. Price for coming out. It is a privilege as well to have a discussion with Dr. Price. I've watched him for years and watched his debates, watched his discussions, read his books. I do have one complaint. He doesn't have the gift of brevity when he writes books, but I do say I have read this whole book and I've read certain sections on numerous occasions. And I think your redactions and some of your work in some of these books has been very inspiring for me, actually. Your work and actually Dr. Ehrman, who have actually the decency to touch these subjects, have inspired me to study them more. And it's been a big part of my dissertation work. It's been a big part of my research. And I've written extensively on both the Gospels we're going to talk about today, as well as others. And I just want you to know that though you and I are very different on our belief system about the person of Christ, I have no animosity against you. In fact, I would say your work has inspired me to take things that you've written on and run with it and see where it led me. So I appreciate the work you've put in. It's really helped me become a better student as well.
Oh, thank you very much.
Oh, absolutely. And also, I did want to give Dr. Boyce a chance to just briefly tell us a bit about your research, particularly into the area of the Gospel of Peter and Thomas, before we get into the topic itself.
Well, I just got done talking about how I didn't have the gift of brevity, or that he didn't have the gift of brevity, but I don't either. So when I did a research paper, one of my deans told me he wanted to have something around 10 to 12,000 words in the Gospel of Thomas. I was like, oh man, that's going to be a lot of work. Well, I finished at 22,000 words by the time it was over, and I feel like I didn't even do justice to it. And so I also wrote a research on the Gospel of Peter, and apparently that wasn't good enough. So I had to do a translation of the manuscript itself, and I actually shared that with Dr. Price. I did my own translation. I'm not going to stand behind it as inspired or anything of the relation of preserved. I didn't pull a King James translation on that bad boy, but I do feel like I did a good enough job to get a good grade, and I did get a good grade. So in my book, it was a success. But studying the Gnostic Gospels has been a big part of my work in the canon. My PhD covers textual criticism and canonicity. So it's kind of a part one, part two. And so looking into the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Apocalypse of Paul, 3 Corinthians. Like, to me, it's a blast. I have fun. Some people would be bored. I think it's great. I've enjoyed every minute of it. It's been one of the most exciting, challenging, loss of sleep to think over things kind of degree I've ever done. But it has challenged me at a depth that I've never had to think outside of the box before. It's forced me to examine my view of things. And as some people, it pushes them further away from their faith. I actually believe it gave me a stronger faith in what I believed about the canonical books that we have. I certainly struggled at some times. Some books, 2 Peter, I cried for a long time one night over that one. But, I cried and worked through things and finally came to some reasonable explanations I just had to get to the bottom to figure out. So this is not a subject that I think Christians should be afraid of. I feel like Christians have shied away from these discussions because they're afraid of what they're going to find. And I don't think that's what Jesus teaches us. I don't think that's what the prophets of God or anybody in the Christian realm or even the ancient fathers of the early church taught, to distance yourself from learning or to distance yourself from educating yourself and finding the evidence, looking for those things. I think the minute Christianity does that, we have a faith and faith movement. It's no longer based on anything of evidence. And so I think that this is a good time for Christians to get uncomfortable and to study things they've never had to study before. So, and if you don't have somebody to push you in that direction, read Dr. Price, read Richard Carrier. They'll push you there. They'll get you there fast, but keep an open mind for sure.
Absolutely. Well, Thank you for that, Dr. Stephen Boyce and Dr. Stephen Boyce and Dr. Robert Price. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we're about to get started. We could not be a better time for having a discussion like this. I received a message earlier today from a guy called William Blessing Paul, who mentioned that he had been receiving questions on this, and this could not have come at a better time. So with that, the format for today's discussion, we're going to have about a 10-minute opening from both sides on the topic. We're going to be focusing first on the Gospel of Thomas, and then we'll move on from there to the Gospel of Peter. And what we're going to do is, after the opening, we're going to have a brief discussion period between both our panelists, and we'll immediately open up for Q&A right after that. So if you do have questions, please keep the questions specifically for either one of these speakers and on the topic of today's discussion, which will be the first session on the Gospel of Thomas. Or if you have questions on the other canonical Gospels, that's fine as well. But please be sure to raise a question relevant to the discussion itself and not something completely off. And then with that, we will go into the second period where we'll have, again, 10 minutes from both sides. I believe slightly less, 7 minutes from both sides. And then we'll go through the same format again with a discussion and close with a Q&A. With that, Dr. Robert Price will be going up first. Your 10 minutes, sir, at your first word.
Well, I have often preached from the Gospel of Thomas during the dozen years I was a church pastor, and I found there was a lot to preach on. Of course, most of the time I preached on biblical passages. So even in that setting, the canonicity question didn't really bother me much. I guess I looked at whether there seemed to be, because I never cheer-led for theology. I didn't think people really wanted to hear that. In fact, I didn't even know what most of my congregants believed. It was an interesting sort of a environment. A lot of them were ex-seminarians or had been from all different backgrounds. And so I just preached on what I saw as challenging wisdom from all of these books, and there was plenty of it to be found, of course. So the canonical limits haven't really, it's sort of moot for me. And when I did the pre-Nicene New Testament, I was kind of taking up the implicit challenge that Helmut Kester gave in a course I had with him at Harvard Divinity School called Heresies, Ancient and Modern. He and Harvey Cox's team taught it. It was really incredibly interesting. And Kester said that he thought the best canon would be the most inclusive one. And despite what you always read, that the New Testament represents the earliest authentic apostolic witness to what Christianity was really about, it seems to me that's become untenable. It's already passed through a long process of selection, largely based on the congruence of these books to the emerging rule of faith that we read in the Apostles' Creed and in Irenaeus and Tertullian and so on. And that therefore it's just as interesting, at least, to look at what survives from other types of Christianity. Now, a lot of that stuff is going to remain in the mothballs probably, because I have some sympathies for Gnosticism, but I don't. But it's more like the way Carl Jung took it. I think they really were on to something in terms of depth analysis of the psyche and all that. But as far as the specifics, it's with all the different heavens and the names of the angels and the archons and the cosmology of it, that seems to me completely pre-scientific and mythical. And since so much of works like the Pistis Sophia, the books of Jehu, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, have to do with giving you a kind of kind of like the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It's giving you sort of a guideline what to do when you die. And it's just, the premise is sort of interesting, but boy, it's hard to stay awake through all the specifics of it. Whereas with something like the Gospel of Thomas, you don't have that kind of thing. It's just a bunch of sometimes enigmatic sayings, which have their own challenge, first to understand them, but also to really ponder the truth in them, perhaps. Like he who has recognized the world knows it for a corpse. Well, what's the implication of that? Radical asceticism, or just kind of a stoic detachment from it? Certainly, at least being, not conformed to this world, but being transformed by the renewing of your mind, as in Romans. And then there's a whole lot of stuff, of course, that's very parallel to the canonical Gospels. And I think most of that is primarily interesting for comparative purposes, like Joachim Jeremias and many others do, trying to assess which is likely the earlier version of this. And it's all intriguing. Some of it is theologically very enticing and profound, like wisdom theology that you certainly have in the Gospel of John, but loads more of it, as when Jesus in Thomas says, "I am the all came forth from me." Well, that's also in the letter to the Colossians, really, that everything came from him and it was for him and it will return to him again. We don't think about that all that often, but here it's put into the mouth of Jesus, and it has a real, it's kind of a riddle, but it's very evocative of reverence. It's high Christology. It's fascinating. The big issues that people debate, in my reading anyway, is not so much should it be added to the canon. I mean, nobody who I read thinks that's even a possibility. Like James Barr says, a canon is formed at a particular formative period of a religion. It doesn't exactly make sense to go back and add stuff to it. In fact, you see what happens when people do try it, like the Book of Mormon. Well, inevitably, it spins the sponsoring body off into a new religion or something on the way to becoming one. So that's almost a moot point. But what they do debate is the Gospel of Thomas earlier than the canonical Gospels? Is it dependent on the canonical Gospels, or what? And I have found both sides to have plausible, even cogent arguments. Those who say it's earlier, like I believe Kester and John Dominic Crossan and others say that it's an earlier book. They point to the fact that it has no real Christology and no Christological titles to it. And therefore, maybe this stems from a time before they began to try to articulate faith in Jesus in titular terms, the Son of Man, Son of God, etc., etc. And that does make sense. But on the other hand, the Gospel of Thomas reads to me as if it was trying to argue against those who already do hold Christological faith in titles. Like in one saying, the disciples say to Jesus, tell us who you are so we may believe in you. And then he kind of brushes that aside and says, you're just like the Jews. And he gets into a parallel with the good fruit comes from good trees and so on. That sounds to me like a repudiation of what other Christians are saying, rather than being innocent of such developments because earlier. So what they say is reasonable, but I don't quite find it convincing. Now, that has to do with the other question: is it independent of the Gospels? And Steve Patterson and various others argue, well, yes, it is. There's no real sign of a use of the canonical Gospels in Thomas. And at one point, I think there's an Achilles heel to that, when Jesus in Thomas combines the I've come to bring a sword saying and the I've come to bring division variant of it. And he says, I've come to bring a sword and division. It sounds like somebody's trying to harmonize two of the synoptics. But on the whole, I think that it makes more sense to say that Thomas is dependent on the canonical Gospels and is later. But how? Well, it seems to me that it was put together by someone who had heard the Gospels read in church, but did not have a copy of his own to consult. And so he gave a bunch of memory quotes from the Gospels, which explains why, on the one hand, they seem to be a little more elaborate, like there are 4 invitations, not 3, in Thomas's version of the Great Supper parable. And sometimes they're simpler, like most of the interpretations given, like the parable of the sower and so forth, and the weeds and the wheat. There's the interpretation in the canonical Gospels is not there. Again, they would say, well, that's because, I mean, form critics and others have always said that, yeah, these explanations were given by the early church to try to help make sense of the parables. Well, it could be, but it seems to me that, again, it's a result of memory quotations. If you just listen to the way people quote the Bible today, even we ourselves who pretend to be such scholars and all that, we wind up paraphrasing them and abridging them and so on just to get a certain point across. And we'd have to look them up again no matter how many times we had read them. So it reads to me as if someone is doing memory quotations and then getting a whole bunch more stuff from other perspectives. I think you can find stuff that seems to be Ebionite, with James as the great patriarch of the church and so on, and enjoining Sabbath observance. Others seems to be Encretite, the celibacy gospel. You can't go to heaven unless you dispense with sex, even within marriage, because that was the original sin. Sometimes it's Gnostic, the few sayings about the pre-existence of souls and all that. So I think it's a kind of a grab bag from various early sources that the evangelist or the redactor or whatever we want to call him made from memory without really drawing much of distinction. Who knows what he took to be the proper faith, but it just seems to be like a sampler to me, and therefore later than the Gospels of the New Testament.
Well, thank you for that, Dr. Robert Price, for your 10-minute opening on the Gospel of Thomas. That was really helpful. Now we turn over to Dr. Stephen Boyce, who will give us his 10-minute presentation on the same topic.
Sure. Yeah, my view of the Gospel of Thomas is that obviously it's not like all the other Gospels, whether you're talking about canonical or non-canonical. It's just a list of sayings. There's 114 sayings. Jesus said this, Jesus said that. There's oftentimes parables that are in there, as Dr. Price had just mentioned, the sower and the seed parables there. You even have a nuance of the sheep. You have the 99 who are left for the one, but there's a nuance to it because the one sheep was the big sheep, and it wasn't the rebel, the sinner, and the tax collector, as Luke 15 paints, but rather it was one who went out and found enlightenment. It was one who found himself and went out of his comfort zone to go find knowledge, and he was being rewarded after Jesus went out and found him. So there are definitely uniqueness to the translation as well as to the understanding of those texts. I look at the Gospel of Thomas, in my personal opinion, after much of the study that I've done, I see the Gospel of Thomas as almost equal to the Q source of what became of the canonical Gospels. The Q source, which some of the Christians on my side do not believe existed, I do, which would feed the ideas into Mark and Matthew and then later bring into Luke. There was a list of sayings that were collected that connected these synoptic gospels together. I look at the Gospel of Thomas similar to how Q operated for the canonical, because from the Gospel of Thomas, there seems to be an evolution of the Gnostic faiths that come through. There does not seem to be, and Dr. Price just said that, there's different nuances that came in. There's hints of Docetism that come towards the end. I do find it interesting that the Nicene belief system permeates the beginning part of the Gospel of Thomas, which is an early form of what became Gnosticism from about 110 to 140 AD, which became dominant because it was a second generation removed from James the Just. There was all kinds of shout outs given to him throughout the time, through history, by guys like Hippolytus of Rome, who mentioned often about the Nacenes and their view of scripture and their view of Jesus and things like that. So there was kind of this early stage that you see. I'm not against the idea that the sayings have expanded over time. In fact, the last saying represents Mary Magdalene, where there was a question and a discussion about her with Peter and Jesus. And it kind of gives this idea that you've got to become a male in order to enter into heaven. And it seems to set the page almost for what would soon become the Gospel of Mary, which is likely a late 2nd century. It's mentioned very early on by some of those who oppose the Gnostic beliefs. But nonetheless, we have 3rd century manuscripts of the Gospel of Mary in fragmented form. It was obviously at the end of the 2nd or early 3rd century, but it seems like it was paving the stage for that belief system of Gnosticism. So there's kind of a Q feel to it when I look at this. And like I stated, we don't know all the details. As Dr. Price had mentioned, there's kind of a large number of dating on this. You see as early as 50 AD to 250 AD. I believe J.R. Porter puts it around 250 AD. And guys like Crossan, for example, would take it much earlier than that into the 1st century. I happen to land somewhere where Valentesis probably places it anywhere between 120 to 140. And the reason I say that is it goes back to that Nicene belief system. You did not see that anymore after the middle of the 2nd century. There's different brands of Gnosticism that permeated in different areas. Cerinthianism was the main one that hit the last part of the 1st century. And then you have this nuanced belief that supposedly descending from James the Just, who comes into the equation, and you see this Nicene belief. And there's examples of that. For example, in saying 9, when you get into the parables like the one that Dr. Price had mentioned, you see the sower went out to go sow his seeds. But if you read it really quickly, you would say, man, that's Matthew, Mark, Luke in their statements about the sower of the seed. But really, there's nuanced phrases that actually came from the Nicene belief system. For example, it says that the seed landed on rock and it did not take root, which follows Luke's gospel, because Luke is actually one that uses that terminology there. But then it adds a phrase that's not in any of the synoptics, and that is, and it does not produce ears. That's in relation to it falling on the rock. So Grant and Friedman, for example, said, we are confronting a combination of this parable with the Nicene belief system of doctrine that goes back to the heavenward ascent of the good seed, because that was a teaching that was notified by Hippolytus of Rome, who mentioned this idea of being the good seed that ascends towards heavenward. So when you see phrases like it didn't produce ears to bring about that result, that's a negative connotation, meaning it didn't find that heavenward ascent. So you see insertions that almost give a Nicene view there. Also, the author chooses different statements to nuance. It seems like a presuppositional view in comparison to the Gospels. For example, in saying number 12, Jesus said to the disciples, we know that you will depart from us. And they ask the question, who's going to be our leader? So you're leaving, and it's almost building the scene of John chapter 14, where we see the famous words of Jesus. Yeah, hey, I'm out. I'm leaving. I'm going to send a comforter, somebody like me. I'm going to send the helper, referring to the Holy Spirit. And it seems like there's a secondary conversation that Thomas is focusing on that's not found in John's gospel. In fact, I would say that if there was going to be a borrowing from the gospels, the gospel of Thomas seems to borrow from John and Luke more than Matthew and Mark. There's much dispute on that. But I would say that the statistical numbers that I came up with were definitely higher for John and for Luke. I do think, and I have proven through some of my work, that he does use unique readings that are only in Luke's gospel in the L source material, or from Mark's viewpoint, the Markan material. And then some are just strictly from Matthew. He seems to know of at least those 4 gospels. So they must have been in existence by the time he is writing. All 4 of the gospels he was familiar with. And I agree with Dr. Price. It's likely that he just had memory of it or had heard it so much. But it is interesting that he would have been that familiar with all four accounts, given the fact that Matthew was predominantly given to a Jewish audience. Luke was kind of navigated and used more in the Gentile world. John would have been permeating more in Asia Minor. So we do see that this guy has a well-rounded understanding of some of the teachings of Jesus. And it's possible that there's actually more than one scribe here. I'm not convinced one guy did this. I think there's an expansion in the text. And even if you look at the 2nd century versus the 3rd century documentation of Thomas, it seems that it's expanding and it's going into a different viewpoint. And you can almost see simultaneously, if you look very closely, the evolution of Gnosticism from the earliest parts of the 2nd century into the later parts of the century. But in saying 12, they're asking, who is our leader? Who do we go to for help? Now, in John's gospel, he said, the Spirit will come. He will bring to remembrance things. He will guide you into all truth. I mean, you see this beautiful layout of Jesus saying, I'm leaving, but I'm sending another comforter like me. And so that settles that comforts our hearts. He even tells them at the end of John 14, comfort one another with this, be comforted, don't be hurt, don't be scared, don't be afraid. Well, the answer in Thomas is totally different. And this really speaks Nicene doctrine. He says, look, wherever you are and wherever you go to James the Just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into existence. So that is complete Nicene doctrine at a massive level. And that needs to be taken note of, because not only did he replace the Holy Spirit's guidance that Jesus shows in John's gospel, but he's bringing James the Just, the half-brother of Jesus, into the equation as the leader, which creates secondary problems, because not only did he say that that's your new leader, he says, hey, I brought the earth, like the whole heavens and earth were brought into creation for him. Well, that's a theological massacre for a Christian who's believing the canonical gospel. It's like, wow, James the Just is special, and so we have to wrestle with that, because regardless of if we date the Gospels where perhaps Dr. Price would put him in the 2nd century, I would put him in the 1st century, Paul does look to James the Just as a leader in the book of Galatians. But the thing is Paul in Galatians did not see it just as James the Just. He mentions 3 pillars. He mentions Peter, James the Just, and John as pillars. He didn't see it as one person. In fact, if we parallel Paul later on the fruit of the Spirit that is produced later in the epistle of Galatians, it is dependent and clearly revealed on the same teaching that John reveals later. Obviously, Galatians was earlier than John, but he's using the same parallels of the work of the Spirit. For example, the first 3 things Jesus taught about the Spirit all the way into chapter 15 is that they would have full joy, peace, and love. Love, joy, and peace. Right there in John 14, transition into 15. That is the first 3 fruits of the Spirit that Paul puts out in Galatians. So when you look at it in parallel, we're saying we're looking for reliability. We're looking for who connected with who. Well, Thomas says that James is the guy you follow. John says it's the Holy Spirit. But James is not just the one you follow. He's the only one you follow, because creation was put together for him. It was for his purpose existence happened. And whereas Paul's like, well, there's actually 3 leaders that I see coming out of the church. It's James, John, and Peter. So there's some conflict there. And then you see Paul agreeing with the first 3 attributes of the Spirit from John 14 and 15. Paul seems to be on the same page with John. Thomas is kind of in his other world. But the fact that he says that about James, this is completely Nicene tradition. So that leads me to believe that this must be somewhere in the area of 120 to 140. And I would lean more towards 135, 140, and I'll tell you why. There's another event that took place that we must remember around 135 AD. We have Bar Kokhba, which took place. And after that catastrophe, there seemed to be an expansion into liberating women and a usage of women, which I think right where the saying stopped, we have Thomas bring in, guess what? A statement about Mary Magdalene. And I think I think that was the last saying. I think a second penman or a third penman put that there, and it introduced a different type. Now, watch the Gospel of Thomas very carefully. It starts out extremely Nicene. It ends introducing almost a pre-Docetism view of what's to come. It's very different. Again, I believe there's multiple scribes that have penned this together almost as a Q source to generate new accounts, which would come from the Gospel of Mary, Philip, and others that would follow. And so I would place it somewhere in that range, which, and that needs to be understood because Hadrian was the ruler from 110 to 140. And when he died, Nicene seemed to just jump off of the scales. Like there's no existence of it anymore. So as far as dependent, I would say that Thomas was dependent on a lot of the Gospels. In fact, Joseph Fitzmyer, one of the great scholars who worked on the Dead Sea Scrolls and things like that, he looked at it and he said this: the Synoptics and the Logia, the sayings, which is the Gospel of Thomas, are indeed so close that it is incredible that the two could be considered independent. But he said, and the evidence shows and goes to show that the writer of the Logia, the sayings of Thomas, was the one doing the borrowing. And I'll close it with this. It's kind of like the commercials you see on TV. You have the car competition commercials. What usually happens is when a company knows that their car is not the American standard, they're trying to compete with the American standard. I will pick on Hyundai and Kia for a minute. I'm sorry if you drive one, but Hyundai is not the standard when you look at purchase amounts of cars like, let's say, the Toyota Camry. And so what a Hyundai and Kia commercial will do is they know they can't compete with the brand on a sales scale. They will try to implement a nuance that's better than the Camry. Buy this vehicle, buy the Sonata. It gets 10 extra miles to the gallon. And you'll hear the commercial say it gets 10 better miles to the gallon than the Camry. What are they doing? They're admitting the standard is the product Toyota. And so what it seems like to me is the Gospel of Thomas is doing similar to that. They're recognizing the standard narratives are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, predominantly Luke and John, and they're almost borrowing from that, saying we're better. And I'll give you a perfect example in closing of where that's the case. One of the most important sayings that we need to note in the Gospel of Thomas is saying 13. Jesus asked the same question that all the synoptics asked, who do men say that I am, so to speak? But this time Jesus said, compare me to someone. Tell me who I am like. Now in the synoptics, he says, who do men say that I am? And they were like, John the Baptist, Jeremiah, one of the prophets from the dead, Elijah. And then he says, no, who do you say that I am? And that's where Peter had his climactic moment of acknowledgement. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said, flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father, which is in heaven, has revealed this to you. Well, that story took a different turn in Thomas as well. And this is where I think the competition comes in. And I'd love to have a discussion about this because I'm willing to be wrong, but I find it ironic that in this same passage, he says, compare me to someone. And Peter spoke first, but he did not say, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. Obviously, we have theology differences. But he did make a positive spiritual attribute to Jesus. He said, you're a righteous angel. And then it's interesting. It's not surprising that Thomas would record Peter because Peter was the one that did most of the talking, even in the synoptic accounts. But then Matthew is introduced, which is interesting. Matthew is hardly ever talking in any of the Gospels. And yet he says, you're a wise philosopher, which is more of a Greek saying. It's more of a Greek viewpoint, and the angel is more of a Jewish viewpoint. But then he goes on and Thomas says, look, my mouth cannot demonstrate and fully say what you are like. And Jesus said, hey, because he called him master, he said, I'm not your master. And he pulled Thomas aside in secrecy away from the other disciples. And he gave him 3 sayings. We don't know. The Gnostic believers still don't know what was said to Thomas there. 3 sayings. And he comes back to the group and he tells the group, he says, I can't tell you what Jesus just told me. Because if I did, you'd pick up stones to stone me, and the stones would shoot fire out and devour you. Everybody would die. This would be a disaster. I have been given secrecy. But what it seems like is that he took a pot shot. The writer of Thomas seems to take a pot shot at 2 of the gospel accounts. Peter is behind the Gospel of Mark, and Matthew, obviously, as believers believe he's behind the Gospel of Matthew. It appears as if the writer is taking a remark as like, you should trust my view of Jesus, because Thomas, he's pretending to be Thomas Didymus. He's saying, I was given secret knowledge of Jesus, and Peter got it wrong, and Matthew got it wrong. So don't listen to their accounts. I got a better view of Jesus. It's almost like that Kia commercial saying, buy my car, I get 10 extra miles to the gallon. No, don't listen to Peter. Don't listen to Matthew. I had secret sayings said to me off to the side that they did not get. And it seems like it has that nuance. So those are my views of the Gospel of Thomas. I am totally fine with having discussions on all of it. It's an exciting thing to look into for sure.
Thank you, Stephen, for that. And both speakers have crossed time, so we meant to keep it to 10 minutes. Dr. Robert Price crossed it, I think, by about a minute and a half. Stephen crossed it by about 5 minutes. So
sorry, I told you I didn't have the gift of brevity. I told you.
I know you warned us beforehand, but that's totally all right. This is a dialogue. We want to allow both speakers to finish that. So with that, we want to go into a discussion period, and I'm going to begin by just introducing a question. And of course, both speakers can feel free to discuss freely after this, and I'll only come in if necessary. Unlike some of the other debates we've seen, particularly on the presidential debates, won't be like that by any stretch of the imagination. But anyway, with that said, we're going to go straight to, let's begin with Dr. Robert Price. And I did want to ask you on some of the comments that Stephen made. And just to begin this, it seems that both of you are very close in terms of the dating. If I understand correctly, both of you seem to agree that it's somewhere in the mid-2nd century, the dating of the Gospel of Thomas. And Stephen did speak about, for example, that the Gospel of Thomas seems to be engaging, writing in the background, responding, if possible, to the other Gospels, particularly the Gospel of Matthew and Mark. We saw that in Stephen's last illustration, where Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" And also, he gave some illustrations of where it's responding to the Gospel of John and Luke as well. So I just want to get some of your comments on that, and we can go from there.
Well, that seems quite likely to me. And the Thomas saying 13 is so important, and that's one of the most clearly, I think, Gnostic texts in there, because the disciples, having seen Jesus take him aside and tell him something, Jesus leaves. Thomas comes back and says, "Well, what did he say?" And he says, "I'm sorry, I can't tell you, because if I did, you'd stone me to death, and then you would be burnt up, as you say." And to me, that is like what happened with Al-Hallaj, the Sufi mystic, who made the mistake of blabbing the esoteric Sufi understanding to all and sundry. He went around saying, "I am God." Well, he didn't mean he personally was God, like a lunatic in the asylum who thinks he's Napoleon. He meant, "I'm God and so are you," because they had a pantheistic view. But how was he to expect that every Tom, Dick, and Harry in Iran would understand that? They took him to be a blasphemer, crucified him, etc. And other Sufis at the time said he was a saint, but he made a big mistake. Let's not do that. And you wonder even if the Mattheans saying, "Don't throw your pearls before swine because they'll attack you," etc. Like, what do you expect? I mean, you're becoming a martyr, which is a big waste since you didn't have to, and now you're implicating them, making them into persecutors. Keep your mouth shut. And the role of a Gnostic, whether Christian or Islamic, was to be like Diogenes and to look around for people that know there is more, like the rich young ruler. "What do I do to inherit eternal life?" "Well, keep the commandments. You know them, right?" So yeah, I've kept them all my life. And he says, "Well, if you would be perfect, do this." And you have to. The Gnostics eventually kept it quiet until they found somebody who seemed to know there was more, and that's what I think Thomas 13 is about. And yet I do wonder if later in the book, when you get into these things like "Blessed is the man who eats the lion, for the lion shall become man," and the blessed is the man, and all that stuff. Like, what on earth is that? I've read plausible explanations for it, but something like that is certainly a riddle. you have to wonder, is this supposed to be the part of this secret teaching of Jesus that still kind of remains secret? As it says in the very beginning, these are the secret sayings of the living Jesus. Whoever finds their interpretation will not taste death. So some of them sound pretty clear. You cannot serve two masters and so on and so on. But some of them, you wonder, what on earth is he getting at? And it's because it's assumed you keep working on it. You ought to be able to get it eventually. So there is, and that's kind of what I think the Gospel of John has done too. When he says in the Last Supper, I have a lot left to tell you, but it's obvious you're not up to it yet. You're not up for it. But don't worry, when the Paraclete comes, he'll take of my store of knowledge and convey it to you. Well, of course, this is a poke in the ribs to the reader. That's what this gospel is. That's why you have all these I am sayings, these spine tingling revelations like I am the resurrection, I am the light. That's going. I mean, I love the Sermon on the Mount, but the Gospel of John are these astonishing sayings. So I think you've got that going on there too. Not that Thomas necessarily got it, but it fits that sort of Gnosticizing emphasis that you find no holds barred in things like the Apocalypses of James and so on, where it says that, well, Jesus had ascended already, but he showed up again, and for some years teaching us what I'm about to tell you. Of course, it's a kind of a gimmick. You figure you know what Jesus would have said that he didn't actually say, but he told me, and I'll tell you now. So there's a big element of that, but there's also kind of, I don't want to say commonplace, familiar sayings of Jesus too, but it's not beyond him to criticize the canonical ones. I think John criticizes Luke in some places, like where in chapter 12, John says, the hour has come. Now, what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, that's why I came to this hour. Well, so much for Gethsemane. And similarly, Jesus doesn't carry his cross in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but they get Simon of Cyrene to shoulder it. But in John, no, Jesus carries the cross. Now, that has to be a correction of the earlier Gospels, because some smartass was saying, oh yeah, Jesus said, take up your cross and follow me, but he didn't take the cross up at all. Not that it is necessarily a contradiction, but people might have thought so. And so John says, okay, let's just cut the knot there. He carried it. And I think there are corrections like that from one gospel to another. And in the beginning of Luke, where he says, yeah, I know lots of people have set down the story of Jesus, but I think understood, none of them got it right. Now here's the definitive version. So that's no big surprise. Else, why write your own gospel if you thought the others were good enough?
Well, thanks for that, Dr. Robert Price. Well, Stephen, just wondering if you want to respond to that, or yeah.
Well, so where do you date the Gospel of Thomas, Dr. Price? Where would you give it a range in your mind?
Mid to late 2nd century, conceivably later than that, because it's sort of a function of when you think the canonical four were written, and I place them around the middle of the 2nd century.
What do you think about the beginning stages, mostly in the first 20 or so sayings, being the Nicene? It seems to be really championing that version of what was a pre-Gnostic belief. If that were the case, does it seem like it would put it closer to the beginning of the 2nd century, because that was more prominent around 110 to 140 AD when it came to looking at Hadrian's rule? It seems to disappear after about 140 AD, that Nicene belief system. Or would you just say that's part of the continuation of the sayings, where it probably wasn't written in one setting, it was probably a collection over time?
Yeah, and if that is the case, then this might have been a surviving vestige of an earlier form, because we know from what the church fathers say that various different groups used the Gospel of Thomas. And as you helpfully point out, why not think they added to it? That's certainly what some scholars think about Q. So you can divide it into strata Q1, 2, and 3 based on similar considerations. That it doesn't sound like it's the same view of things later as it does further. So the Nicene material may not have been the latest portion of it.
Yeah, it seems to be the earliest portion, which would make sense with when it was started. To me, it would seem like it's starting earlier in the 2nd century when that was prominent. And it kind of leaves that form of Gnosticism as it goes through all of the sayings. It actually almost sets up although Docetism was prominent at places, it really didn't take off until the late second, early 3rd century, up to when Athanasius expelled it out of Egypt at his time. And so my only argument, I guess I would say from that is if it has early attestation of that time period between, say, 120, 140, and it was borrowing from all of the Gospels up to that point, even in the Nicene section, I would place that to me shows that the canonical Gospels are earlier. And I know we differ on that, but it seems to show that the Gnostic Gospels were following. And I think I remember reading in your book where you believe that John may have been the most cited by the Gospel of Thomas, or you may have mentioned it was regularly referred to or something like that.
I don't remember, and nor do I remember the facts, the statistics there.
You don't remember everything you wrote in this book that big?
I'm senile. I'm 66, and I can't remember names and all kinds of stuff.
It appears to me that if it's an earlier collection that expands into the Gnostic evolution that was being brought in, that if it's borrowing from John very early on, like in saying 8, for example, then it's going to show some level of, or even Mark, for example, when it says for the first shall be last in saying 4, you really see that laid out in Mark 10:31. So it seems like the early forms of even the Nicene flavored side of it, which would be earlier in the 2nd century, is already collecting some thoughts from the canonical Gospels, which to me would place the canonical Gospels much, much earlier than mid to late 2nd century.
When did the Nicene start out? I remember reading a book by R. Gordon Rylance that he seemed to think that it was an Alexandrian movement pre-Christian. And if that's the case, depending on which sayings you mean, it's possible some of them were pre-Christian even. But again, I don't know the specifics offhand with them.
Well, I would say with like saying 12, for example, where he says, your leader is James the Just, and the whole heaven and earth is created for him. So the Nicenes became their 2nd generation. So you had James the Just, his disciple, and then his disciple brought in the Nicenes. So a couple generations over, and they were the most dominant between, if I remember correct, 110 to 140 under the Hadrian and his rulership. And it seems like once that guy was off the scene, I mean, it just got eliminated. And then it was like, welcome to Docetism. I mean, it was Docetism. And most of like the Gospel of Philip and Mary become more Docetist than anything. So it seems like the evolution happened somewhere around the mid 2nd century, but the Nicenes were not prominent after the middle of the 2nd century. That's why I bring it up. And I consider Thomas to be like Q. I call it the Gnostic Q document. And I'm willing to be wrong about that. I've thought about it. I've rolled ideas. I've talked to different scholars about it, and they're like, it is kind of like Q. And so I was like, well, I'm going to call it the Gnostic Q for now. And so I see that kind of idea there. But to me, if the Nicenes were the early part of the 2nd century, and claims like that section there was directly taken from John 14 with the new twist, that means John would have been earlier than the middle to early 2nd century. If I'm correct, that would be my estimation.
Well, James was thought to be a sort of the mouthpiece of Gnostic teaching too. I mean, later stuff like in the Apocalypses and Apocrypha of James. So the fact that he's designated as the one to go to might reflect that. Who knows? Like, because it's not clear in that saying. In fact, I tend to think, and this is, of course, just a guess, that when it says, wherever you come from, you will go to James the righteous. That sounds to me kind of like in the epistle of Peter to James, I think it is, or is it James to, yeah, Peter to James, where he says something about how all the missionaries report back to James. And that's kind of what Paul does in the book of Acts, in fact. And so that, I mean, anybody could claim that sort of thing, any Gnostic or whatever groups. That might not be enough to make that scene specifically.
Well, it kind of goes with some of the nuances that are in that section. Like I was stating, they did not produce ears. That whole heavenward ascent toward the good scene that Hippolytus of Rome. If we didn't have Hippolytus of Rome, we wouldn't know anything about the Nicene. He pretty much preserved their entire belief system through what he said. So we're very dependent upon him, and we're assuming he got it right on his estimation.
Well, that's the best we know. What the heck? Yeah.
Correct. And so like even phrases like that. And I remember throughout and I think you reference Grant and Friedman often in your book here. You reference them a few times in their opinion. They are convinced, it doesn't mean they're right, but they are convinced that the early portions are heavily Nicene. And so I think that creates an interesting discussion, at least.
Oh, yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah.
I'm just wondering in terms of, well, before I get to that, I want to announce that the time to ask questions is now open. If you do have a question, please submit it with the initial of the speaker in all caps so that we will know who your question is addressed to. We are not going to take questions addressed to two people because we simply don't have time for that. And of course, any questions addressed to me will go on unanswered, and maybe I'll just respond to it in email or something like that. But yeah, please address it to both the speakers and make sure you've got their initials in front. Well, before we go to the Q&A, last point, I'm going to give this time to Dr. Robert Price. Is there anything that Stephen said in the opening statement that you would necessarily want to respond to? Please do so if you want to.
Now, we're covering a lot of the same ground. And when he has said things I haven't thought of, I'm pleased to learn from him.
Well, that's amazing. Yeah. Is there any final comments you want to make, Stephen, before we go to the Q&A?
No, I think that it's good. I find this discussion healthy. I think that there's discussions about the content in these Gospels that do not get recognized. And it's like Dr. Price mentioned, there are some weird stuff that even Gnostic interpreters don't even know what in the world's going on. And it was an excellent point that Dr. Price had just brought up a minute ago. He lets you know up front, this is a book of secret sayings. Like it's not a secret that it's a book of secrets. It's telling you it's a book of secrets. And that's supposed to be this journey, because the Gnostics almost have this belief of a divine, almost inner spark within all of us. And you're searching and you're searching and you're searching. And the closer you get to finding yourself, in fact, that is a phrase used a few times in the gospel, is those that find themselves. It's that inner self. And that's exactly what the sheep that ran away from the 99 did. And he was rewarded by Jesus. He wasn't the sheep that was the tax collector and sinner that was chased after and brought back and restored to the fold. He left the 99 and was rewarded for getting out of that section and actually going and finding himself. So Gnosticism is definitely in there. It's an extremely Gnostic book, but it's not as Gnostic as people think. It's almost the early stages of it. It's not as Gnostic as, say, the Gospel of Philip or the Gospel of Mary. Those are a little bit more deliberate. And at times you're trying to follow the writer, and it seems like he's just compiled all of these different viewpoints and just kind of conflated them into this interpolation of them. And it's pretty interesting what we've come up with. And Dr. Price, you brought something up a minute ago that was important. It seems like the different regions that have some of the existing manuscripts, Nag Hammadi being the most important, but even the fragments of Thomas or a quote from Thomas, it definitely seems like in different places, there's different ways of saying some of the sayings, or they're not even lining up at all. So it does seem like in different regions, it had a different brand or a different viewpoint.
Well, thank you for that, Dr. Stephen Boyce. First question that came up really was not addressed to any one speaker, since we really have hardly any questions. We're going to take this one. But again,
We answered everything. Man, that's great. We answered the whole Gospel of Thomas
comprehensively. Well, the question that Sahil Luke raises up is that what about a giant Jesus and a giant talking cross, like the one in the Gospel of Peter? Well, I guess we're dealing with the Gospel of Thomas first, but anyone want to address the question about the giant Jesus?
Well, we talk about that one in a minute, I guess, when we get into Peter.
Absolutely. So Dr. Price, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I've always wondered if that's supposed to depict Jesus and the two angels as giants, like in the book of Revelation, where you have a giant angel standing astride the shoreline, or if it simply means that the three are ascending to heaven and that Jesus is in the lead, like a V formation. I kind of lean toward the latter because it's a little hard to imagine what the writer would have had in mind if he's trying to make them into giants, though that's not impossible given the fact that there are giant angels elsewhere.
I agree with Dr. Price on that, where it's like more of an ascent. And then I pause and go, okay, but then it also talks about the cross talking. So it's like, maybe it is a giant Jesus after all. If there's a talking cross, why not have a giant Jesus?
Or maybe it was an audio book version of the titulus from the cross, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. But here they said, well, let's have them actually say it.
Well, on that note, there's another question which is completely unrelated to anything that you guys discussed, but it's similar to on the note we were in, and it's from Trevor Riley saying, is anyone going to comment on the epic superhero collection Dr. Price has? Is anyone going to comment on the epic superhero collection that Dr. Price has? So
we commented on it. We talked about it. It was great.
Well, we technically commented about it before the show started. So, unfortunately, we're not going to comment on it now. But with that, we want to move on to the Gospel of Peter. Since we don't have any questions on the Gospel of Thomas, our panelists have comprehensively covered that. To the Gospel of Peter, and this time we'll start with Dr. Stephen Boyce. So we do have one question by Chris Celia, just came in. We'll take that. Right. Okay. Two questions just came in. We'll just take that and we'll go straight only with these two questions. Then we'll go to the Gospel of Peter. Both questions addressed to Dr. Price. First question by Chris Celia. How role do the Gnostic Gospels play in studying the historical Jesus? I suppose he means what role do the Gnostic Gospels play in studying the historical Jesus? Even though they are false Gospels, do they still validate Jesus of Nazareth was in fact a historical person?
I don't think so, because it strikes me that, F.F. Bruce and many others say that you can tell Christians did not feel at liberty to attribute their own ideas or their own prophecies, perhaps, to the historical Jesus, because, and then they always refer to in 1 Corinthians 7, I say not the Lord, but this I say by the word of the Lord. That seems to be enough to convince them. And I always think, have you never read the Gnostic Gospels? I don't think any of that stuff goes back to a historical Jesus, even if there was one. And you can't simply assume that the Gnostics, they weren't real Christians, so they could say any damn thing they wanted to. No, this is a huge bunch of evidence that at least some Christians felt like they knew what Jesus must have said or would have said and therefore did say. I mean, we still have people doing that today. Well, Jesus said a penny saved is a penny earned. Or you see billboards with some smart statement and it says signed by God or by Jesus. What are you, the prophet Isaiah or something? Where'd you get this? And so I think, if anything, the existence of these gospels filled with historically spurious statements heavily undermines the argument that early Christians wouldn't have done Jesus the dubious favor of attributing their views to him. Today, it's the same kind of thing where people say, I'm pretty smart, and Jesus was certainly very smart, so he must have agreed with what I think. And it's just invalid reasoning. Or like when people say, well, the Bible's against abortion. Well, that's a neat trick, since the Bible never mentions abortion. Now, I am anti-abortion. I think it is murder. I'm not for it in any way, but I would never say, hey, the Bible condemns abortion. It ain't in there. But people feel like, well, it must be because I think it's true. And so that's, to me, the main relevance of it. Now, Margaret Barker is a little bit different. In her book, The Risen Lord, she argues that, how early, Gnostics and some early Christians mentioned 1 Corinthians and so forth, thought that the only resurrection Christians would experience is the spiritual one in baptism, and that there'd be some sort of an afterlife, but the bodies wouldn't come out of the tomb. Well, Margaret Barker argues that's what Jesus experienced and what the earliest Christians thought, that at his baptism, he had a transforming visionary ascent into heaven, like described in Enoch and various other apocalyptic works. And she likes to quote stuff from some of the Gnostic Gospels to illustrate that. So she's kind of coming, in fact, the subtitle of the book is The Historical Jesus as the Christ of Faith, or maybe it's the other way around. But I don't know of really anybody else who does try to take Gnostic texts as warrants for a historical Jesus. That'd be kind of tough to do, I think.
Thank you for that, Dr. Robert Price. Shalom to a few people joining as well, Kevin Wong and Slam RN. Well, one more question for Dr. Price, and then we will go straight to the Gospel of Peter. That is, for Dr. Price, what does Dr. Price think of Eusebius' Ecclesiastical History 325 to 325 1 to 7? Yes, that's a question addressed to you, Dr. Price.
What is that section about? I'm afraid I don't know.
If I remember correctly, Dr. Price, it's his list of books that he lists as received, disputed, and accepted, and then heretical, because in heretical he does mention Thomas, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, what I find interesting about that is that it's still not quite settled in the discussion, even in his time in the 4th century. That doesn't prove anything, but it does. I think David Trobish is right that you probably have a pretty early canon list that we still use, formulated by Polycarp of Smyrna. But it is hard to square that with Eusebius reporting like this, that some people were still thinking that the Gospel of the Hebrews ought to be in there, the Shepherd of Hermas, and so on. So that's interesting counter evidence that kind of keeps the discussion nebulous somehow. That late, there were still apparently tolerated opinions about the canonicity of various books.
Thank you. Well, that's a great question from Finding Truth. It's a wonderful channel as well. Encourage you guys to want to check that out to do so. Well, with that, we move to the Gospel of Peter, and this time we'll have Dr. Stephen Boyce start. 7 minutes this time, Dr. Boyce. And again, if you do cross it a little bit, that's totally fine as well. So with that, 7 minutes, whenever you're ready.
I just want you to know I blame you for not having a timer. I'm a former Baptist. You should know better.
Well, the thing is that, I mean, if you want me to announce it at the end of 7 minutes, I could. But
just wave. Just wave at me or something.
You just start saying,
yeah, just
for one reason, No, you won't be able to see it because this is not, this is a virtual background. And the only reason it's changed, for those of you who are wondering, is all due to Slam RN's fault. She came and complained that the last one didn't look too good. And at her request, we've got that changed. So just in case you're wondering who is responsible for that. But with that, I'll waive 7 minutes, Dr. Stephen Boyce.
I'll keep it even shorter than that really quickly. The Gospel of Peter, we're really at the expense of a manuscript being found in an archaeological excavation that was buried in a tomb of an ancient Egyptian monk. It's a manuscript that is dated about 8th to 9th century. I was able to, with my cool technology, pull the manuscript up, which is in black and white, put new lighting on it, make it look yellow. In fact, if you look at my translation of it, I took each section and I am no technician on the computer, but the lighting was definitely me. I did that, believe it or not. So I was able to look at the manuscript very closely and also follow Boryant's view of it, who is the man that found it. So it's a fragment that consists of 14 sections. It's broken down in what we've listed as 60 verses. Sadly, we do not have the entire gospel. I wish we did. But what's interesting is the part that survived is probably the part we want the most. And that is the whole narrative of the trial, the death, the burial, and believe it or not, the resurrection of Jesus. In fact, it gives more information about the resurrection than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It tells you the name of the garden that Jesus was buried in, the Garden of Joseph. It tells you Petronius was the centurion who was given to be the guard of the tomb. But it seems like that the writer is really working hard to convince you that tomb was sealed. There was a body in it. In fact, there were witnesses both of, there was many centurions there. Even a crowd from Jerusalem came and checked the 7 seals that were put on the tomb to make sure it was really sealed. And so then they went their way. So it was approved by the Jews. It was approved by the Roman government, tomb sealed. No other way to explain it. What we find about the amazing thing about the canonical gospels is that there's no explanation as much about how Jesus came out of the grave, what that looked like, how that took place. It's more of people showed up, he was gone. The disciples came, the tomb was open, there's no body. And then Mary Magdalene has an experience with Jesus himself. She thought it was the gardener, but there's really not much description. Well, Peter gives us a very vivid description of what happened. 2 angels came in, slid the door open just a little bit, carried him out, holding him up by the hand, getting him there. And then as we talked about, this just giant ascension view, and there's a voice from heaven coming in. And the next thing you know, the cross is talking, and it's like, what is happening? I feel like I'm in a sci-fi movie. I mean, what's going on? It's more detailed because it's trying to convince you that Jesus truly did raise from the dead. Now, I believe he did, but the Gospel of Peter is working hard to convince us even more. We do have some interesting citations of Peter that we do not no longer have. For example, 2nd Clement, which is probably not Clement. I've done a lot of work on 1st Clement in my dissertation work, but 2nd Clement actually quotes what seems to be the Gospel of Peter on sections we don't have existence to. We're completely dependent on this one fragment. But it is different from the canonical Gospels. I know that it has been dated as one of the earliest Gospels. In fact, it has been, Crossan has it as one of the first Gospels. And I just cannot agree with that. I think it's early 2nd century. I do agree with Dr. Ehrman that it is not a copied gospel of the synoptics. It seems like, similar to the Gospel of Thomas, the writer of this was going from memory, the stories that he remembered, and he gives us nuances that I think we should consider as perhaps historical accuracy. Maybe the guard's name was Petronius. Maybe he was, we don't know all the details, but these are interesting. Now, it has been considered Docetism because it talks about how Jesus was on the cross as though he felt no pain. And so they think, oh, that's Docetism. In fact, one of the early fathers said as much, but he also said it was, for the most part, pretty accurate. So I mean, so I don't know how, to me, it's not. I don't think Docetism would value a resurrection. I just don't think they would put much emphasis on there. The more I studied the Gospel of Peter, I got unpopular with my Christian friends because I refuse to call it Gnostic. Maybe it is. We don't have the rest of the book, so my opinion's still up in the air. But from the fragment we have left, I do not think it's a Gnostic gospel. I do not think it's canonical. And I don't think it belongs with the four gospels we have. I think it's inferior, but it does borrow certain aspects of the gospels that we have as well. It uses stories like from Mark chapter number 15, and it seems to blame the Jews. It was really trying to get Pilate off the hook. Pilate was so innocent in this. It was all the Jews. He washed his hands. They refused to wash their hands. It is definitely an anti-Jewish book. Whoever wrote it was mad at the Jews for what they did. Of course, he claimed to be Peter, and I was actually shocked when I got midway. I got to the Greek word ego, and the writer was talking in the first person. I was like, whoa, what is this? And then I get to the very end. He says, I, Simon Peter, my brother Andrew, and he talks about going out with Matthew or Levi. He calls him Levi in this one. And then it ends. The manuscript ends. We don't know what happened. Is there a post-resurrection appearance? We don't know. You're left in the dark. But that is pretty much the Gospel of Peter. I do not accept it as canonical. I could say it's slightly historical, reliable, but I wouldn't consider it equal to any of the four.
Well, thank you for that, Dr. Stephen Boyce. We now go to Dr. Robert Price with his 7 minutes. And anytime you're ready, Dr. Price.
Well, I used to go to the Episcopal Church, and every Good Friday I would go to the service there and carry with me, believe it or not, a copy of the Gospel of Peter, because I got the idea because I read that in somewhere that in one of the church fathers or whatever that Christians in Palestine used to read it on Good Friday. Wow, that's interesting. I loved stuff like that about the early church and what they did. And so I would, for several years, I would bring a copy of it and read it there sitting in the pew during the Good Friday service. I kind of stopped that when they cut the Good Friday service and just used the Palm Sunday liturgy twice in 1 week. What a mistake. But I found it, a good devotional sort of thing, though, of course, I don't like the nastiness toward Jews in it. But there are a lot of interesting things about it. For instance, that since there are no resurrection appearances, it makes you wonder, Jesus goes directly from the tomb into heaven. And based on the widespread New Testament use of Psalm 110, many scholars have said that they think the original version of the resurrection was that it was the same thing as the ascension, though there may have been visions vouchsafed to various people from heaven, rather like Stephen's, I guess. But the resurrection was the ascension. Well, we don't know how it ends, as you say. The end is missing, but this, even putting it that way, that he ascended right out of the gate, right out of the tomb. That's an interesting item. Crossan's book, The Cross That Spoke, says that the cross gospel was earlier than the four gospels because they seem to have borrowed details from it, and it was a barely narratized testimonia collection. And he compares it to various items, for instance, in the Epistle of Barnabas, where they tell you what details in the scapegoat ritual of Leviticus 16, I think, and various other things were seen as typological or prophetic depictions of the crucifixion. And with Crossan's tendency in Who Crucified Jesus and other works to say that prophecy was made into history by early Christian narrators, I was expecting him to say the very thing he seems to be leading to in The Cross That Spoke, that the whole passion narrative was constructed out of these supposed prophetic foreshadowings. He doesn't go that far, but to be consistent, he ought to. But he says the cross gospel was used by the four canonical evangelists, and this was not exactly the same as the Gospel of Peter that we have. And he says you can divide up the material in the Gospel of Peter between what would have been the original text of it, and then materials from the four Gospels added later, and then material that editors used to patch that stuff in. And I use different typefaces in the pre-Nicene New Testament to make that the differences clear. I found the argument pretty plausible, though again, you can't really prove it. But it's an interesting possibility. What do you think of his theory about that, Stephen?
I think it's interesting. I know you. That's the first thing I ever read in your book, and you did put the different looks on there. To me, I struggle with the fact that if the Gospel of Peter inserted details more than the Gospel of John or Luke or Matthew, for example, talking about Petronius, the name of the centurion, or the idea of, if these were the original writers being Jewish, putting that much blame on the Jews the way that they did, it would appear to me that those gospels would have expanded upon the details that they had, like he was in the garden of Joseph. It specifically says the garden that Jesus was buried in. None of the synoptics or John mention the name of the garden. None of them mention how many people came and made sure the seal. It doesn't even say it was sealed 7 times. It just says it was sealed. So what we usually see in transmission of a new text is that there's expansion. And to me, it looks like Peter's doing the one expanding. So I would struggle with Crossan's theory. I think it's interesting, the traits. I think you did an excellent job. In fact, I was bragging about you the other day to somebody. I said, I think he did one of the coolest studies and details on what would have and what could have looked like, where it came from. I don't know if anybody can match your work on what you did right here. I think
the italicized stuff where I give possible preceding and succeeding.
Yeah, I think that was, I just want you to know, is after I translated the whole thing and I was so proud of myself. And then I get over here and I'm like, what is this? It showed me up so bad, but it's like,
I know it did. I'm glad you liked it. I liked it, but I wouldn't, there's no comparison though.
But it was so well thought out, but I would struggle, and you can tell me what you think about that. I would struggle with Crossan's theory, because if there were details and the gospel writers were trying to follow up behind Peter, I would imagine they would have took those details and expounded upon them even more than what was in the Gospel of Peter. That's just my theory.
Yeah. What do you think of the theory that the apocalypse of Peter was originally part of this? I don't know what the current discussion is, but I know I've read that somewhere.
It's probably because the manuscripts that were discovered in that archaeological find was the Gospel of Peter and the Apocalypse of Peter. I find the Apocalypse of Peter to be an interesting, I'll say this, the Greek is similar in places, and that might be some of the theory, but that could be the scribe too. I mean, we're talking about 8th to 9th century. We have nothing newer than that. But when we know, for example, the Apocalypse of Peter, I think has probably, most Christians don't realize this, it has introduced our view of hell. Probably people believe in hell today in the Christian church more like the Apocalypse of Peter than Jesus himself taught, whether they believe that or not. Dr. Ehrman brought that out in his new book. But I think that they are probably similar because they were found in the same codex that was ripped up in that tomb. And typically what happens is, and I know you probably know this more than I do, guys that would be buried with the manuscript was probably because it was part of their life work. So whether that guy, piled them together because he saw something historical. The apocalypse of Peter was not necessarily looked at as heretical. Some of the
Right.
fathers considered it at times. Most did not, but I do find it interesting that the Gospel of Peter has a little bit of positive comment to it. Who is it? Serapion? Who
Yes.
said? Yeah, he was giving a positive shout. He said it was Docetism, only primarily based on the fact that Jesus said but the thing is it said it's as though he felt no pain. It didn't say it was. And then I know that the statement of Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, why have you forsaken me, has been altered to power, my power.
Yeah,
which,
that's interesting.
Or my strength, dunamai. And I highlight it actually in the article I've written on it. I actually blew it up really big so people could see power, my power. He's speaking of, though he had something which could be Gnostic, because they obviously, a lot of them believe that the God man came on the human at the baptism and abandoned him at the cross. So I mean, we could see maybe some stuff there where they were right, but as a whole, I don't find it to be Gnostic at all. I find it actually just to be a historical narrative.
Yeah, I think there's as though he felt no pain. It seems to me that was just trying to show the stoic courage of Jesus, kind of like when he makes no reply and he's being beaten and all that. So I wonder about that too. And the fact that it was is on second reading that Serapion thought, well, I guess there must be something to this. Oh, maybe it was this, but that doesn't prove anything. The my power, why have you left me? That strangely reminds me of the Tolet of Yeshu, that he had borrowed magic power from having stolen the knowledge of the divine name from in the temple. And so that when his power deserts him, that's when he's defenseless, they crucify him. But who knows? But the power thing doesn't sound as much like Gnosticism as it does the idea that Jesus was a magician. But of course, I think that the Gospel of Peter author must not have thought that. He would have probably thought that was.
And to me, I don't think the Gospel writer was actually looking to move to a more Gnostic viewpoint. In fact, I would say the writer was intentionally trying to prove the resurrection more severely than the Synoptics and John. I would say, again, to me, if he is the foundational passage of the text, the earliest text of this narrative, as Crossan suggests, then when you come to Mark, depending on if somebody believes in the long ending or not, it's an open tomb, story ends kind of ordeal, or Luke or John with Mary Magdalene or whatever. To me, it seems like those guys, if they were borrowing from the Gospel of Peter, would have ran wild with it if they had an agenda. That is one of my biggest arguments in defense of the Gospels that are in the canon, is because they're not trying to go out of their way to make a statement like, oh, he's gone, here's my evidence. It's just, we showed up, tomb's empty, he showed up to us later. It's not a scene of beauty and splendor and ascension and angels and singing and voices. And it was pretty much guards got scared and passed out. I mean, that's the best we get. I would also ask you your thoughts about Luke's parallel, having one of the thieves on the cross speak. Though Peter's gospel and Luke have different stories about what was said, but Luke was the only one that ever records really the idea of one of them looking at the other and saying, we've deserved our punishment. Whereas the Gospel of Peter, he's not rebuking, the other guy. He's rebuking the crowd. What do you think about that discussion there specifically?
Well, it does sort of sound like a embellishment of Luke's version. It's something similar happens at the baptism, comparing Mark and Matthew, where the heavenly voice in Mark speaks to Jesus, you are my beloved son. But in Matthew, to the crowd, this is my beloved son. I'm not sure how much that matters in either case, but it is the same sort of expansion. And it seems to me that this is a Lucan creation, originally part of his apologetic agenda for Roman readers. That you see, even this guy says, Jesus, like, criminals, I'm one, I know what they're like, this guy isn't one. Which is also why in Luke, the centurion at the cross says, not this was the Son of God, but this was a righteous man. Get it, Roman reader? And so that would certainly mean that Peter is using Luke. But, Crossan's argument is slippery, because he says, I'm not saying that all of that stuff was in the cross gospel, though it's in its descendant, the Gospel of Peter. Bruce Chilton had a hilarious comment on this at the Jesus Seminar one time. He said he went to stay with a friend, and in the guest room of their house, there were a whole bunch of towels, each one with the trademark of a different hotel, the Marriott, the whatever, the different ones, the Hilton, and so on and so on. And it's sort of like a joke, right? That you're getting the big hospitality treatment here. And Chilton said, now, what's more likely? That my host stole those towels from all those hotels he had been in, or that he simply had all these original towels created with those monograms, and that representatives of all those hotels visited his house and said, hey, that looks good, I think I'm going to borrow it. It's just that's the way it is with the gospel passages in Peter. Did other gospels find it there and decide to use it, or does it depend upon the later ones? And Crossan technically isn't guilty of that. His argument is plausible, but yeah, I sort of go with Chilton on that.
Yeah, I would say that the Gospel of Peter is a follow-up of those. Yeah. So what year do you place the gospel? If you entertain Crossan, that would put it very, very early. Again, I know your position on the Gospels is mid-late second century. How does that affect your four gospel view being later if Peter's earlier?
If these earlier,
if Peter's earlier, does that affect your view of the four gospels and their dates?
You mean if the cross gospel was earlier? Because Crossan says it was because he thinks it was used by the four evangelists. But right. You mean finished Gospel of Peter?
Yeah. Would you say that would still be first? Would that force you to believe that the four gospels in the canon were borrowing from Peter in the first century, or they borrowed from Peter much, much, much later down, still around
later, because of the fact that so much of the stuff that Crossan sees feeding into the cross gospel is attested in for us in the Epistle of Barnabas, which is generally thought to be a second century work, but who knows? I mean, it's really so slippery, all of it is.
Yeah, that's true. I would just, to me, when you look at the early writers, they seem to reference the early church writers. They seem to reference this book, as we talked about. Even in the late second century, they're already talking about it. So it's got to be at least at the worst 150. I would put it closer to the end of or the beginning of the second century personally. But when you look at the dating of this, it's interesting that it's not referenced that we know of outside of Second Clement, which does seem to reference sections of it, but it's sections we don't have. So we're assuming that's what it is. But none of the fathers, outside of mentioning it, they really don't quote it. But Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're quoting all the time, including Polycarp. You had mentioned Polycarp's in Smyrna, Bishop of Smyrna, who was allegedly a disciple of John. I've done extensive work on him. He quotes Matthew frequently. The Didache quotes Matthew over 25 times. So it's interesting that I just struggle to put that before, when it seems like it's an afterthought that almost imagines more than what even the four accounts have. I think it expands the four accounts, but I wish we had the rest. It would probably help us if we had the rest of the gospel. We just don't.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, so sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Price. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
All right, yeah. We are running out of time, and do we have questions piling up for this one, unlike the previous one on the Gospel of Thomas? So, well, apparently the Gospel of Peter is more popular than, in this sense, than the Gospel of Thomas. So much for what everyone else was telling us about the Gospel of Thomas being the most popular non-canonical Gospels.
Well,
Well,
that's because Thomas is just a bunch of sayings and Peter has a cross talking with the giant Jesus. Of course, it's going to be more exciting.
that must be the reason, I guess. Well.
Indeed.
We go to the Q&A straight away. We have questions for both Dr. Boyce and Dr. Robert Price as well. So we'll start with Dr. Price. Question from Finding Truth. What is your criteria when determining if an ancient document is historical or not? How do the canonical Gospels fail? And how did the Gospel and of Peter and Thomas reflected? It's quite a mouthful, that one, but did you want me to repeat that?
Oh, no, that's okay. I think, for instance, the fact that virtually every narrative in all of the Gospels can plausibly or highly probably be understood as rewritten from the Old Testament, usually the Septuagint, and and that there is no secular, quote unquote, or profane evidence in the Gospels of suggesting a real biography. And what is there perfectly fits the mythic hero archetype. Now, it could be that, for instance, Jesus was a historical individual and was doing all sorts of stuff between his visit to the temple when he was 12 and his visit to John the Baptist when he was 30, but there was nothing much to report. Maybe he was praying and reading scripture and so on, but nothing all that exciting, no miracles and so on. That, of course, is a gap that early Christian imaginations filled in with all these outrageous infancy gospels. But it seems to me that no evidence is no evidence. And when all the stuff we do read is so much like the Old Testament stories of Elijah, Elisha, David, Moses, etc., that's really got to make you wonder. And this, several scholars have zeroed in on this, and I just sort of compiled a lot of their arguments, the ones I found plausible. And it was a big surprise to me. There also is, there's nothing placing Jesus, despite his superhuman abilities and deeds, in the historical record, as there is with certain other figures who were dramatized by such embellishment, like Caesar Augustus, Cyrus of Persia, and others. They're woven firmly enough into the fabric of history that you can't just say, well, Caesar Augustus was a myth. You got too many gaping holes in history if you do that. Not the case with Jesus. Scholars who never even thought of Jesus being a myth had said that the depiction of Pilate, compared with that in Josephus and Philo, just doesn't sound like the same Jew-hating, Jew-baiting tyrant you have in those sources. He's trying hard to get Jesus released because he's afraid of a few rowdies under his balcony. The Herod the Great story sounds so much like Josephus's retelling of Moses' nativity and persecution and so forth. And though Herod was a murderous fanatic, plenty of his crimes are listed by Josephus, not this one, whereas it does fit what Josephus says about Moses. With Caiaphas, you got the problems that have been debated for decades and decades about the legality of the trial procedures and the very notion of having this hearing on Passover Eve. It just seems like whoever came up with the story just didn't know his Judaism. And so on and so on. So it seems to me that though there may well have been a historical Jesus, there's no particular reason to think so. The burden of proof is on the one who would argue that there is. And I don't think they've met that burden. I'm not saying I know there was no historical Jesus, or that, boy, I sure hope there was no. That's absurd fanaticism, but it seems to me highly doubtful.
Thank you for that, Dr. Price. Well, we do go to Dr. Stephen Boyce next, and the question is coming from David Keane. He asks, let me see, I could read it from here or from here. I'll read it from here instead. Well, do you think it's an unwise move by apologists to appeal solely to Orthodox patristic testimony, for example, Irenaeus and the Gospel writers, for historicity, when heretical works may have some value?
Oh, I 100% agree. I think it is. I think it is a bad move for Christian apologists to neglect the very kind of books we're talking about tonight. I don't think that we should ignore Irenaeus and Tertullian or Polycarp or Clement or people like that. I use them all the time. I've written extensively. I've taken all of their citations. I've taken all of Polycarp's, Ignatius, and pulled them out and compared them to the Greek texts we have today. It's been most of my doctoral work, and that should be a good primary source we start with. But I think we are not doing good apologetics when we ignore the Gospel of Peter in the discussions, when we do not take into account the Gnostic Gospels. Again, I believe that when we look at these Gospels, we find that they're not equal. I feel like they're copycat Gospels of the original. I think that when we Christians have a wrong view of them, and more of the skeptic and atheistic views I have found have a wrong view of them. The skeptic atheistic views of them go, oh, look, there were all these different gospels. They must all be equal, and the best debaters won out kind of mentality. That's just not consistent with history, though. That's not consistent with the viewpoints of them, because it wasn't just one location that was saying one thing about the four gospels and another about these other texts. This was a permeating church-wide thing from North Africa then into Rome or into Syria, or whether you're looking over more into the Byzantium Empire. It was a regular thing that they were all calling out the same books as being given to them or passed on to them from apostolic sources, whereas these other ones, they were saying, we've never received these, we don't recognize these, etc. Now, it could be argued that they're all wrong, but I believe that their testimony consistently lines up with the churches throughout the world that would reject these. But the matter is this: they are historic documents. They are 3rd and 4th century fragments and usage that was in our history. And I think any Christian apologist who's willing to neglect history or any recorded documentation, whether they think it's too mystic or whether they think it's too heretical, I think to just shelve them as if they have no value is to say that surviving history has no value. And most Christians believe in the sovereign act of God, that he is in control of the things that happen in the universe. Then the discovery that was on accident by the shepherd boy Muhammad Ali, who found these, rediscovering all these Gnostic texts that had disappeared for 13 to 1500 years, and all we knew of them was what ancient writers had said. We have to conclude that it was also on purpose that we found these. And I'm not afraid to get into these subjects. I'm not afraid to talk about these. Again, I believe that these make Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John look like gold after studying. Now, Dr. Price may differ with me on that, and we can talk Star Wars later and be okay with our differences. But I believe that these texts actually, when we say, oh, well, they're all equal, that's the one side. The Christians say, well, they're just ridiculous. We don't need to study them. I think they're actually losing the value on the four gospels, because I think that if they actually studied these, it would cause them to appreciate the four gospels that they read out of more. So I would say we do not need to give ourselves solely just to the church fathers, the patristic writers, and the gospel accounts. I don't think that's good study, just studying one side. I think we need to read all the material that history has given to us.
Well, thank you for that, Dr. Stephen Boyce. We go next to, well, and one of the questions that was asked was kind of similar to the first one, namely the one that strive to enter into the narrow gate asks, how did Dr. Price use his discernment to know right from wrong if not all the evidence presented in the study of the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Peter, if that was the case. I think that was kind of like the question that was asked before that. So I'm just wondering if you just consider that answer, Dr. Price, or would you like to respond to this as well?
Know what's historically authentic and what isn't? Is
I
that
believe, well, he actually says, sorry, just 1 second. Yeah, he says that to know right from wrong, I guess, yeah, that's what he's talking about. Yeah, historically.
Well, there are a couple of things. One is the principle of analogy that, or what some call methodological atheism. The idea being that there may well be a God, there may well have been miracles, but if so, they're untraceable by the only means the historian has, namely using the well-attested grasp of what happens today and within verifiable memory as our guide as to what probably happened in the past. Now, knowing that a historian's results must always be provisional and open to revision. If my favorite example of this is if you come in at night after a hard day's work, you plop down in front of the TV and turn the set on. First thing you see is a giant reptile crushing Tokyo underfoot. What do you think you're watching? Do you think, oh, this is the news channel? No, I guarantee you're going to think, oh, this is the sci-fi channel. Because why? It's not unthinkable that there could be a giant monster hidden away who finally came out. Now he's on a rampage. It's conceivable. But has anybody ever attested or recorded this? Have you ever seen the like? Given that the answers there are no, you kind of have to assume, well, I've never seen Godzilla in person, but I have seen a lot of cheesy Toho Studios movies. I'm willing to bet this was one of the latter. And that's the same thing with miracle stories. We weren't there. We don't know what did or didn't happen. We don't know whether there can be no miracles or there can be miracles. We just have to judge by what we see in the world as to what probably did or didn't happen. And that's all the historian can do. He's not an oracle in reverse, knowing what happened in the past. And so there's a problem there, especially the volume of miracles attributed to Jesus and others. He's like Superman behind me there. Anybody that needs a miracle, he's there to provide it. There's no doubt that he'll be able to do it. And it just seems fictional to me. Another thing with sayings, given, like, as I say, I have arrived at the tentative conclusion that there wasn't a historical Jesus, but for my method, I say, let's assume the basic gospel portrait of an itinerant Jewish sage and an apocalyptic prophet is the historical Jesus. What do I make of it when we have Jesus talking about being persecuted already and his disciples being outlaws? That doesn't seem like it fits yet in the historical continuum. That came along later, and it sounds to me a lot like this has been projected into the past because these are concerns of the readers in the days the Gospels were written. My favorite example of this is where Jesus says to a crowd, if whoever would be my disciple, let him take up his cross and follow me. Well, you can try to wiggle out of that, but it just seems to me highly unlikely that that this is a reference to Jesus' crucifixion, and that the listeners and the readers know that's what it is, and you've got to be able to follow Jesus on the Via Dolorosa. But that makes no sense in the historical description of the itinerant prophet and sage Jesus. No, how could they have known what the heck he was talking about until it had happened? So things that seem anachronistic in a major or minor way, I would say, I'm crossing that off. And there are other ones too, but those would be two of the big criteria.
Well, thank you, Dr. Price. Well, we do have finally just final two questions for Dr. Price. I'll kind of link them together due to time because we are running out of time. And this will be the final question then. So it's from Timothy Mitchell. He asks, what do you make of the references to Jesus in the Babylonian Talmud Sanhedrin 43a that references Yeshua as being a sorcerer hung on the eve of the Passover? And when Celsus wrote on the true doctrine in the late 2nd century against Christianity, why did he not appeal to Jesus as not existing, or that he was never crucified?
Well, he was admittedly dependent on Jewish polemics against Christianity. And so they made of Jesus a sorcerer, a black magician, etc. There are other adjuncts to that. And likewise in the Talmud, well, both sources are too late for us to be sure they're not just reflecting anti-Christian polemics. I mean, they are any way you cut it. That's why they're in both of those documents. It could be that they are preserving information about a historical Jesus, but it's just way too late, and the tendentious motives are too obvious. We know they're aimed at Jesus as a polemic, just as a lot of Christians today love to denigrate Muhammad, saying, oh, this guy's a child molester and so on and so on. Was he really? It's so motivated by hatred that you have no idea if it's also preserving fact. And so I just don't think they're reliable sources. I wish they were. That would give us more information.
Well, thank you for that, Dr. Price. And with that, guys, we do thank you for all your questions that came in. We are out of time, but before we do go, we just want to let our speakers have maybe about a minute or so to just conclude whatever it is, their presentations for both the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Peter. We'll start with Dr. Price, maybe in 60 seconds or so, if we just want to have a few words to sum up the entire discussion this evening.
I think that the importance of the Nag Hammadi Gnostic text has yet to be fully appreciated. The only person I know of that has begun to do it is Elaine Pagels in her book from decades ago now, The Gnostic Gospels, because she is about the only one who sees these documents as the scriptures that nourished a living faith. Everybody else seems to implicitly regard them as some kind of ancient science fiction novels or something. They're just sources of data about what we don't really know. Well, yeah, that's true too. But the fact that these were scriptures, people copied these things for decades, if not centuries, and used them because they embodied their beliefs and so on. I'd like to see these documents treated as monuments to real alternate types of Christianity. I mean, there are, in the Nag Hammadi text, you've got evidence for Jewish Christianity, pre-Christian Jewish Gnosticism, Melchizedek sects that, like St. Augustine mentions. There's Zoroastrian Christianity represented in the Apocalypse of Adam. What was going on? The early church must have been fantastically diverse, beyond anything F.C. Bauer or Walter Bauer ever thought of. They didn't have access to this stuff. So I'm hoping that in the future there is more study of these things as the documents of living religions that help us to reconstruct them.
Thank you, Dr. Price. And Dr. Boyce, you have about just 60 seconds.
Yeah, I was going to jump in. Some of the discussion about the ancient Jesus, I know that kind of deviated a little bit. I did want to read, and I've actually had the opportunity to take one of Dr. Carrier's classes just recently, and he and I dialogued about this as well, and he discredited my quote. So, but I want to read Tacitus real quick, because he did make a statement about a real Jesus. He said, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most inquisitive tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and most mischievous superstition. Thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful for every part of the world find their center, became popular. And that was from Tacitus. Now, I know Dr. Carrier discredits whether that was legitimately Tacitus and things like that. We had gone back and forth for a while on that one, had some fun discussions, but there were obvious, and Tacitus wasn't looking at it to defend Jesus. He was nauseous about the Christians. I mean, he thought there was some conspirator group meeting in secret, which we know is church. He thought they were conspiring, and he was concerned. And you had plenty over there worried to death. They're all scared to death. These Christians are up to no good. But he recognized that there was this Jesus guy that they called the Christ, who he recognized one of their governors during the reign of Tiberius, and he mentions Pilate. And I know that we're in the closing, but I wanted to say, like, there are some quotes out there too that can be discredited, I'm sure, but seems to be these, even the Roman government acknowledged some level of a historical man who went by Christ, or his followers called him that. And he reckoned, now obviously Tacitus didn't believe that, but he still recognized somebody was crucified under Pontius Pilate, who was given the brutal penalty greater than what Nero was given to some of the Christians. But I agree with Dr. Price's conclusion on the fact that these Gospels, I do not think, and obviously we conclude differently about them, but I don't think they should be neglected. As I stated just a minute ago, they are a part of our history. They are survived historical documents. And do I believe they're directly related and inspired the way that I believe Matthew, Mark, Luke, John is? No. But there's a lot of works that are not inspired, and we read them all the time. There's nothing, we assume the history about George Washington is real. We don't have a problem reading our history of our own country. Whether even in the good or the bad parts about our country, we still read the bad parts too. Well, Christianity had its fights. And if we can read the Gospels of Thomas and Philip and Mary, I think it'll help Christians understand some of the arguments that guys like Athanasius was dealing with, the people in the Nicaea, what they were dealing with, and Arianism coming in, Gnosticism coming in. If you don't know what they were teaching and what the document said, then you're really not going to appreciate the arguments they compiled against them. You're not going to appreciate the stances that some of these churches took against some of these teachers who were coming out, or forgeries or pseudo apocryphal books and things like that. So I think we're actually only reading a half story if we don't read the whole thing. And hey, there's quite a bit of these Gospels that are now translated into English. You can go online and read them for free. I invite every Christian to do that. I think it's a fantastic thing. And I think you're going to go home and hug Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John a little tighter, in my opinion. But I think you'll appreciate the beauty of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I appreciate Dr. Price's spirit in this. I appreciate that he even recognized the majesty of John. I know that he would not conclude about John the way I would, but he at least recognizes our Gospels are beautifully written. And so I will say, hey, that works for me. I can accept that. But I would consider the fact that I believe Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are superior to the others. I believe that they were directly given by the apostles, through whom Paul, Peter, working with Mark and Luke, but then John and Matthew. And I think the early churches point to that attestation. And I believe they're God's word, and I believe that they reveal Christ in his fullness to the truth. And these others are just helping us understand greater parts of history.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that, Dr. Boyce. And since you actually did more of a opening statement again, I'm just going to give maybe about 30 seconds to Dr. Price.
I had to. You skipped me in the questions. He got more questions.
I'm going to give about 30 seconds to Dr. Price if you want to respond to anything he just said before we close.
Well, just with regard to Tacitus, even if it is part of the original text, and I think there are real questions about it, but let's assume it is real. The problem is that this also is too late. I don't think there's any reason to think that Tacitus wasn't simply reflecting what he heard from Christians. Like any discussion of Reverend Moon or Joseph Smith today usually is independent of any experience with them. Nobody's met anybody who knew these people, at least with Smith, for instance. And so I think there's no reason to say that he had any genuine even second or third hand information. It's like looking up Jesus in the Encyclopedia Britannica. Yeah, he's there, but that's no real evidence for the issue we're about. But this is the ongoing game, which is loads of fun. All of these documents are just endlessly fascinating, and they need no other justification for our giving them such attention.
Did you and Dr. Carrier rehearse that answer? I'm pretty sure you scripted that's the exact answer that he had given, as well as that it was handed on from second and third information. And my only thing that him was is he wasn't speaking on the outside. He was saying our governor, our leader, and he was almost speaking that he had not gotten this from the Jewish gossip, but that he had actually gotten it from Roman by using the pronoun our governor and referring to their history. It seemed that way to me. What's that?
I mean, okay, he wasn't a Parthian. I mean, can you really push it more than that?
It's really interesting that we had to close at this moment. Maybe we may have another dialogue. Who knows?
Sure.
This has been fascinating. I'm sorry, Dr. Price. Could you repeat that, please?
I said, you guys are a lot of fun. Anytime you want to do it, let me know.
Well, that is an honor, sir. Thank you so much for that. And guys, I really hope that you've enjoyed this discussion. We are absolutely big time grateful to Dr. Robert Price for coming on, as we are to Dr. Stephen Boyce, who never fails to show up on this channel, and he will continue to do so. I will promise you that. Thank you also to Finding Truth. Well, Santi, thank you for your super chat as well. You didn't have to. Really appreciate that support. Unfortunately, not going to be able to find $5 coffee here. So you may want to double that up. I'm just saying, you never know. I'm just kidding. But guys, if you've enjoyed this, we're going to be having more dialogues on this channel. Hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so that you get notified every time we go live. And if you don't already know, on October 30th, 9 p.m. Eastern Time and 9 a.m. Hong Kong, Malaysian time for you on October 31st. If you're in Asia, we're going to be having Dr. Bart Ehrman on the channel doing a debate with Jonathan Sheffield. And the title of the debate, I understand, has just been changed. It is Have Most Christian Churches Got the Wrong New Testament? That is going to be interesting as well. And until next time, I'm Samuel Nason, and on behalf of our panelists, Dr. Stephen Boyce and Dr. Robert Price, have a good evening